My son stood there, bracing his body against the doorframe of my own home, blocking the entrance with both hands. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, you can't come in right now. Saskia's family is inside, and we're discussing some private matters." I stood frozen on the porch, staring at my own flesh and blood standing in the doorway of the house I had built with my own hands. Just 15 minutes earlier, I had finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the municipal water treatment plant. I had driven home in the biting, freezing late autumn wind, intending only to pick up a folder of engineering files I had left on my desk. It was Saskia, my daughter-in-law, and her parents celebrating something lavishly. When I inserted my key, the heavy brass lock clicked. The solid oak door opened only halfway before it stopped abruptly. Julian, my 29-year-old son, had shot out like an arrow. He didn't greet me. He simply braced his entire frame against the door, shutting it almost completely, looking at me with a mixture of panic and hostility in his eyes, as if I were a common thief trying to break into his private sanctuary. "Welcome back to Whispered Truths. I'm Garrick Vance. Grab yourself a warm cup of coffee, a few snacks, get comfortable, and I will tell you this gripping story of betrayal, greed, and a father's ultimate quiet retribution. Before we begin, please do me one small favor. Leave a comment with the number 1 in the section below so I know you are ready, and hit that subscribe button. Your support is the absolute foundation that keeps this channel going." My hand rested flat on the steering wheel of my old Ford F-250, motionless as the engine hummed quietly in the driveway. I stared at my hands. Today, those hands were trembling. Not because of the freezing wind howling off the Atlantic, but because of a crushing, suffocating sense of humiliation that was tightening around my chest like a steel collar. Beyond the wind-swept windshield, my 2-story red brick house stood solid and quiet beneath the darkening evening sky. But today it no longer felt like my home. It had been taken over, invaded by the very son I had once carried in my arms, and a daughter-in-law who wore a saintly, perfect smile. I looked back at the front door, remembering the coldness in Julian's eyes. I had searched for even the slightest trace of respect, a single flicker of filial warmth, but there was nothing. Only an invisible, unyielding barrier. He had repeated himself, driving every single word into my chest like a blunt nail. "Dad, you can't come in here. Saskia's family is discussing something extremely important." My son's wealthy in-laws were inside my house. They were sitting at the mahogany dining table my wife, Emmeline, and I had spent an entire year saving up to buy. They were eating expensive catered food, drinking fine wine, and I, the true owner of the house, the man whose name was on every legal deed, every tax document, and every mortgage payment, was being turned away at the front gate like an unwanted beggar. The late afternoon wind swept across the wooden porch, biting and freezing. I pulled my key slowly out of the brass lock, the sharp sound of metal scraping against metal ringing out in the cold air. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. If 31 years of inspecting and maintaining the city's high-pressure water systems had taught me one fundamental principle, it was this: when a major pipeline develops a dangerous leak, shouting accomplishes absolutely nothing. You stay quiet, you remain perfectly calm. You trace the water back to its original source, and you shut off the main valve. I turned around, walked down the wooden steps, and headed straight back to my truck. Julian stood on the porch, watching me with a tense, guarded stance until I started the engine and backed out of the driveway. I sat in the truck, staring into the rearview mirror. My house still looked solid, its brick facade and heavy timber frame appearing untouchable, but I knew its foundation had already rotted away from the inside. Let me tell you how everything fell apart. I drove away from my quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, heading south toward the industrial flatlands of the county office district. My mind was strangely, terrifyingly calm. When you have spent your entire career working with high-pressure municipal water mains, you learn that panic is your greatest enemy. If a steel pipe begins to crack under hundreds of pounds of pressure, panicking will only cause the entire street to blow apart. You must breathe, analyze the structural integrity, and locate your allies. I needed an ally right now. I needed Gideon. Gideon was my best friend. He was a retired structural and mechanical engineer who had spent 40 years inspecting commercial bridges and heavy steel foundations. He was a man who could spot a microscopic hairline fracture in a massive steel girder with his naked eye. 10 minutes later, I walked into the old, dimly lit coffee shop on the corner of the harbor. I sat down at a corner wooden table, my hands finally flat and still. Gideon looked at me. He didn't ask any stupid, unnecessary questions. He simply slid a steaming mug of black coffee toward me and waited. I told him everything. I told him about Julian blocking the doorway, the panic and hostility in my son's eyes, and the wealthy laughter of Saskia's parents echoing from my dining room. Gideon listened in absolute silence, his rough fingers tapping a steady, rhythmic pattern against the table. For the past 31 years, I had been Garrick Vance, the dedicated guardian of the city's water infrastructure. My entire life had been defined by compliance, verification, and following procedures to the letter. I believed in official stamps. I had always believed that if a man lived honestly, worked hard, and respected the rules of society, life would reward him with a quiet, peaceful retirement. My wife, Emmeline, was the exact same. She had devoted her entire existence to taking care of our family, placing an absolute naive trust in the people she loved. We had built that brick house with every single dollar we managed to scrape together. We had even established a comprehensive family trust to secure Julian's future, making sure he would be taken care of long after we were gone. Everything had been set up systematically, legally, and perfectly. I believed I was a good guardian. Gideon looked at me, his deep, gravelly voice dropping into a quiet, serious whisper. Garrick, even the most perfect, state-of-the-art system will fail if someone deliberately sabotages it from the inside. Are you absolutely sure there weren't any warning signs before tonight? His words sent a sudden, freezing chill racing straight down my spine. My mind instantly began flashing back to the evenings over the past 6 months when Saskia, our thoughtful, highly organized daughter-in-law, had come to visit. Saskia was an outstanding senior legal assistant at a prestigious high society law firm in the city. She was a woman of meticulous detail. She always knew exactly how Emmeline liked her coffee, extra cream, very little sugar. Her politeness, her organizational skills, and her sheer perfection had once filled Emmeline and me with immense pride. But now, as I sat in the warm coffee shop, that very perfection sent a wave of shivers through my body. A senior legal assistant at a major corporate law firm knew the law inside and out. She knew where the loopholes were. She knew how to navigate through complex asset structures and estate paperwork that ordinary people would never even think to question. I took a slow sip of the black coffee. It was bitter, matching the taste of my own foolishness. I realized how incredibly naive I had been. I had spent decades worrying about the high-pressure water pipelines running beneath the city streets, making sure the city's water flow was clean and secure, while completely ignoring the poisonous, silent current that was quietly flowing inside my own home, eating away at the very columns of my family. I said goodbye to Gideon, walked back out into the freezing autumn night, and climbed into my truck. I didn't drive home. Instead, I parked in a dark, shadow-shrouded corner across the street from my house. I sat there in the silence, watching the bright, warm lights shining from our living room window. Through the large glass, I could see Saskia's family. They were laughing, chatting, raising their wine glasses. Julian stood right beside his wife, nodding in submissive agreement as she pointed to a document lying flat on the mahogany table. I narrowed my eyes, leaning forward against the steering wheel. It wasn't an ordinary piece of paper. Even from across the street, I could see the distinctive deep blue color of the legal specialty paper used for binding certified estate documents. My heart skipped a violent beat. Suddenly, a memory flashed in my mind. 1 week earlier, I had received a brief, automated email notification from Casco Bay Trust, the local bank where we held our family trust account. The email had notified me of a minor change in our account security information. At the time, I had been exhausted from a double shift and had assumed it was nothing more than a routine system glitch, deleting it without a second thought. But now, as I connected all the pieces in the dark of my truck, a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The blue document on that dining table was the key. It was the weapon they were using to strip Emmeline and me of everything we had spent our entire lives building. And the horrifying truth behind it was far more terrifying than anything I could have ever imagined. The lights in my living room finally went out, one by one, casting the front porch into deep, shadows-draped obscurity. Saskia's parents' luxury sedan started up slowly, the deep rumble of its engine sounding muffled in the freezing air. Its headlights sliced like massive, golden blades through the thick, rolling coastal fog as it backed out of the driveway and disappeared into the dark night. I remained seated in the cold cabin of my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the dark, silent house. Julian and Saskia had gone to sleep. They slept soundly, wrapped in the comfort of a home they believed they had successfully stolen. While I sat in the freezing cold of the autumn night, planning their reckoning, it was time for me to find the answers. I opened the truck door quietly, the hinges well lubricated and silent, and crossed the dew-covered, freezing lawn without making a single sound. I slipped around to the back of the house, unlocked the wood-framed service door with my old mechanical key, and stepped inside. The transition from the biting coastal wind to the dead, heavy warmth of the interior made my skin prickle. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic metallic hum of the refrigerator. It was the scent of an empire built on stolen ground. I walked straight into my first-floor home office, closing the heavy pine door softly behind me. I switched on the small desk lamp, its soft yellow glow casting long, distorted shadows across the neatly arranged technical manuals, mechanical blueprint tubes, and water pressure charts on the wall. My mind was racing, replaying the image of the blue document Saskia had been holding earlier. A professional senior legal assistant like her would never waste her time on anything minor. She worked for Vance and Blackstone LLP, one of the most prestigious corporate law firms in the state. She was a master of organization, relentless in her precision, and she knew exactly how to construct a flawless legal facade to hide her movements. She understood that ordinary people rarely read the fine print, and she used that knowledge as her shield. I opened the heavy wooden desk drawer where Emmeline and I kept our physical financial binders, our mortgage deeds, and our original family trust agreements. On the surface, everything looked perfectly normal. The leather folders were in their exact places, untouched, dusted as if no one had ever disturbed them. But my maintenance instincts, sharpened by decades of searching for hidden microscopic fractures in high-pressure water systems, told me to look beneath the surface. I pulled out the main Casco Bay Trust binder, my fingers turning the pages with rising anxiety. The physical sheets were there, but the digital reality was what mattered now. I turned on my desktop computer, waiting for the screen to boot up, the soft hum of the cooling fan sounding incredibly loud in the dead silence of the night. I logged into my personal email account and typed Casco Bay Trust into the search bar, my breath fogging slightly in the cold room. The notification email from the previous week appeared on the screen. I clicked it open, and as my eyes scanned the lines of sharp, digital text, my breathing caught in my chest. A new co-owner had been officially added to the joint family trust savings and investment accounts belonging to Emmeline and me. The new name on the account was Saskia Thorne. The legal mechanism listed for this change was a professional abbreviation, PO power of attorney. An icy shock ran down my spine, a sensation so cold it felt like physical needles pricking my skin. I had never signed a single power of attorney document giving my daughter-in-law authority over my personal affairs. To obtain a valid POA, Saskia would have needed my legally authenticated signature, witnessed and certified by an active notary public. Such a measure was reserved exclusively for situations where the account holder had lost their mental or physical capacity, or had voluntarily delegated their authority. I was perfectly healthy. I had worked every single day for the past 31 years without taking a single day off. I was in full possession of my faculties. So how, in the name of God, did she manage to obtain a certified power of attorney over my life? How had she managed to bypass the security systems of a major financial institution? Then a specific, complex clause in our family trust agreement flashed in my memory. The trust had been designed 20 years ago with a specific emergency safety feature. In the event of an extreme medical crisis or sudden incapacitation of one trustee, the signature of the other primary trustee was sufficient to temporarily appoint an administrator to manage the funds to pay for medical care. Saskia, with her deep legal training, had studied our trust documents with terrifying, cold-blooded precision. She hadn't targeted Emmeline. She had targeted me. She knew I was the one who managed the family's financial accounts. She believed that if she could somehow get me out of the way legally, the entire financial system we had built would open itself to her. I started connecting the dots, the rapid sinister gears of their betrayal turning inside my mind. 3 months earlier, Julian had come to my office at the water plant, his face pale, his hands shaking, and his eyes bloodshot, asking for an urgent, highly confidential loan of $150,000. He claimed that he and Saskia's newly opened high-end restaurant, the Gilded Hearth, was experiencing a few minor, temporary cash flow difficulties due to changes in the local market and rising ingredient costs. I had refused. I had refused because that money represented Emmeline's entire retirement fund, a sacred nest egg we had sacrificed our youth, our health, and our comfort to build. Julian had flown into a violent, unhinged rage, screaming that I was a cold, selfish miser who cared more about bank accounts than my own son's future, before storming out of the office and slamming the door so hard the glass partition rattled. Now, as I sat in the dim yellow light of my home office, I wondered what those minor cash flow difficulties had actually been. I immediately logged into a commercial business credit reporting database. Using an active administrative account Gideon had once lent me for a municipal infrastructure audit. I typed in the corporate registration number and the tax ID for the Gilded Hearth. The financial report that flashed onto the glowing monitor looked like a high-pressure municipal water main, bursting apart under a busy city street, flooding the foundation of every building nearby, though the gilded hearth wasn't facing minor, temporary difficulties. It was hemorrhaging more than $11,000 every single month. The report showed a crushing, suffocating stack of debt. Over $80. Susan in overdue supplier invoices, unpaid commercial taxes, months of back rent, and an active foreclosure warning from their commercial landlord. They were standing on the absolute precipice of complete ruinous bankruptcy. If they went under, Saskia's career as a rising star at her law firm would be shattered, and Julian's dreams of being a wealthy restaurateur would evaporate. Saskia needed money, a massive, immediate injection of capital, to save her high society reputation, her luxury lifestyle, and her legal career. And she had chosen to hunt within her own husband's family. My thoughtful, perfect daughter-in-law, the woman who remembered exactly how Emmeline liked her coffee and brought us fresh pastries every Sunday, was secretly preparing a terrifying, cold-blooded plan to drain every single dollar my wife and I had saved over 3 decades. I shut down the computer, the screen fading to a cold black as the room fell back into a heavy, deathly silence. I stood up, walked into the dark living room, and looked toward the small, hidden security camera, nestled inconspicuously on the bookshelf between 2 old, leather-bound encyclopedias. I had installed that tiny motion-activated camera years ago to monitor the house whenever Emmeline and I traveled, and Julian had absolutely no idea it even existed. He had always assumed I was just an old, low-tech mechanic who didn't understand modern technology. With trembling fingers, I opened the security app on my phone and logged into the secure cloud storage. I scrolled back through the recorded history, searching for the footage from Tuesday morning at exactly 10 a.m., a day when both Emmeline and I had been away at our jobs. What appeared on my phone's screen made me realize that Saskia wasn't just trying to steal our retirement savings. She was preparing to throw Emmeline and me out onto the cold street with a scheme 100 times more ruthless and calculated than I had ever imagined. The cold, neon blue glow of my phone screen cast a sharp, ghostly light across my face in the dark living room. I watched the video play. The front door of our empty house opened, and Saskia walked in. She wasn't alone. A tall, middle-aged man wearing a tailored gray suit and carrying a heavy leather briefcase accompanied her. They sat down at our mahogany dining table. Saskia reached into her designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of blue legal papers. I zoomed in on the screen, my eyes strained in the dark, watching her every movement with absolute agonizing clarity. Her meticulous, professional training as a legal assistant was visible in the organized way she arranged the documents on our table. Saskia pointed to a specific clause on the paperwork, explaining something to the notary. Then, she leaned forward, picked up a black ink pen, and signed my name with a firm, practiced, and incredibly decisive stroke. The man in the suit nodded slowly, showing no suspicion. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a heavy circular metal seal, and pressed it firmly onto the signature page. It was a notary seal. They were finalizing and certifying a forged power of attorney right there in my own house, using my own dining table with a breathtaking, terrifying level of confidence. I paused the video, my chest rising and falling heavily as I struggled to draw breath in the silent, cold room. The truth was, I had been so focused on maintaining the massive, high-pressure pipeline systems beneath the city streets that I had failed to notice the catastrophic leak that had developed right inside my own home. I had been blind. But now the silence was over. The investigation had officially begun, and I was going to follow the trail of this poison to its very source. At exactly 8:30 the next morning, I walked through the heavy glass doors of the Casco Bay Trust branch in the county center. The air inside the bank lobby was thick with the artificial scent of industrial air freshener, fresh paper, and cheap institutional coffee. The cool blast of the air conditioning did nothing to extinguish the fire burning hot and deep inside my chest. I felt my teeth grinding, my jaw aching from the sheer force of my anger, but I maintained a completely flat, unreadable expression. I had to be a technician today, not an angry father. I sat down across from the account manager, a professional-looking woman named Clara, who wore a tailored navy blazer and a polite company-mandated smile. I placed my identification card flat on her glass desk. In a voice that was perfectly calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotion, I said, "I am Garrick Vance. I need to review every single document related to the ownership and administrative changes made to my family trust account over the past 2 weeks." Clara looked at me, then at her monitor. She began typing, the steady, rhythmic clatter of her keyboard filling the heavy silence of the office. As she scrolled through the secure database files, her polite expression shifted ever so slightly. the color draining from her lips. She looked back up at me with a look of quiet sympathy and underlying panic in her eyes. Mr. Halverson, your family trust account was modified under a registered power of attorney 2 weeks ago. Clara explained softly, her hands folding over her keyboard. The legally appointed attorney, in fact, is Saskia Thorne. The paperwork submitted appears to be entirely valid, bearing your signature and a certified notary seal. She currently has full legal authority to withdraw funds, transfer assets, and conduct any financial transactions on your behalf. According to our system, she has already initiated a series of pending transfers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hands on the desk. I kept my body perfectly still, resting my hands on my knees, looking Clara straight in the eyes. I have never signed any such document, I said, my voice a quiet, freezing rumble that made her sit up straighter. I want to see the original physical power of attorney. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second, realizing the massive legal implications of my statement. She stood up, unlocked the security gate, and walked into the secured archives room in the back of the bank. The 5-minute wait felt as long as my 31 years on the job. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant chatter of tellers, and the thumping of my own heart. When she returned, she was carrying a manila folder containing documents printed on the distinctive blue specialty paper used exclusively for certified legal instruments. She slid it gently across the desk toward me. My eyes locked onto the signature line at the bottom of the page. The space reserved for the principal's signature. There in dark blue ink was my name, Garrick Vance. At first glance, it looked remarkably like my handwriting. The slant of the letters, the spacing, and even the aggressive, decisive underline I always placed beneath my name had been imitated with terrifying skill. Saskia indeed was clever. She had spent years quietly observing my signature on tax forms, Christmas cards, and utility bills around the house, practicing it in the dark, refining it until she believed it was flawless. But she had made one fatal mechanical mistake. I gently ran my index finger over the cool paper, stopping at the first letter, the capital D in Garrick. My natural, handwritten D always had a very distinctive, sharp curve at the bottom that swept sharply back toward the left. It was a physical habit I had carried since my younger days in the military, a muscle memory that had never changed in 50 years. But the D on this forged document curved entirely in the opposite direction. It was too rounded, too smooth, too perfect. This wasn't my natural signature. It was the work of someone mechanically trying to trace and copy a pattern they had memorized, lacking the raw, unpolished speed of the real writer. It was the signature of a legal assistant, not a systems maintenance engineer. I lifted my head, my eyes cold as ice as I looked at Clara. This is not my signature. This entire document is a sophisticated forgery. Look at the letter D. It curves the wrong way. I want you to make an official copy of this document immediately, and I want a formal written freeze placed on all pending transactions. If you transfer a single dollar of my retirement funds, Casco Bay Trust will be held legally liable for facilitating grand larceny. Clara became incredibly tense. She took the document back, her fingers trembling slightly as she realized the massive legal liability Casco Bay Trust was facing. If they had activated a forged power of attorney without properly verifying the identity of the principal, the bank could be held liable for hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. She immediately picked up her phone, calling the bank's Security and Risk Assessment Division, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. I stood up, took out my phone, and took high-resolution photos of both sides of the forged document, making sure to capture the red circular notary seal in the lower right corner. The seal bore the name of a notary public named Cassian Sinclair. Saskia believed that her position as a senior legal assistant gave her the power to manipulate the system, using official stamps and blue paper to blind the bank's clerks. But she had forgotten one fundamental truth. No matter how sophisticated a system is, the human element will always leave behind the smallest flaw, and that incorrectly curved D was the flaw that was going to tear her entire world apart. I walked out of the bank, gripping my phone tightly in my calloused hand. I got into my truck and immediately drove straight to the county recorder's office, housed inside a cold, gray stone government building downtown. The air inside the building was damp and cold, and the sound of my heavy work boots striking the marble floor echoed sharply through the grand corridors. I had arranged to meet Beatrix Montgomery, a highly respected attorney specializing in complex asset fraud and estate recovery. Beatrix was an old acquaintance of Gideon's, a woman known for her razor-sharp legal mind. When I walked into her office, she was waiting for me, surrounded by towering stacks of legal case files and the comforting scent of aging paper. I placed the high-resolution photographs of the forged power of attorney on her desk. I pointed directly to the incorrectly curved D in my signature, and then to the red circular notary seal bearing the name Cassian Sinclair. Beatrix put on her reading glasses, leaning in close under her desk lamp to study the images. She didn't say a word. Instead, she turned to her computer and began typing rapidly, accessing the state's active notary public database. Suddenly, her fingers stopped on a line highlighted in bright red. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp as scalpels behind her spectacles. Garrick, Beatrix said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous whisper. Cassian Sinclair was indeed a licensed notary public in this county. But he passed away 6 months ago. His license was officially revoked and his physical seal was ordered to be destroyed. My heart pounded violently against my ribs. The notary seal on my forged power of attorney was fake. Saskia had used her position at Vance and Blackstone LLP to gain access to the secure archive of expired, returned, or undestroyed notary stamps belonging to deceased or retired officials. She knew that bank clerks rarely cross-referenced a notary's active status in the state database. They simply looked for the physical presence of the seal in the blue paper. She had gambled against the system, and she had won the first round. Beatrix leaned back in her leather chair, a sharp, cold smile playing on her lips. Your daughter-in-law is incredibly reckless, Garrick. She forged your signature. She used the seal of a deceased notary to bypass the trust controls. This is no longer a civil family dispute. This is a class of felony. It is first-degree identity theft, forgery of a legal instrument, and grand larceny. I stood motionless, my teeth clenched so tightly my jaw ached. The betrayal had gone far deeper than anything I could have ever imagined. Saskia had stood in my kitchen, smiling her sweet saintly smile, making coffee for my wife, while using the stamp of a dead man to rob us of our life savings. She intended to throw Emmeline and me out onto the street to fill the $11,000 monthly financial hole of her failing restaurant. Beatrix slid a blank sheet of paper and a black ink pen across the desk toward me. Now, she said, her voice turning cold with determination, we begin the counterattack. The first step is for you to authorize me to file emergency subpoenas. We will freeze your family trust account, compel the bank to secure their surveillance footage, and launch an internal investigation at Saskia's law firm. I picked up the pen. My hand was perfectly steady. I signed my name at the bottom of the authorization, ensuring that the letter D in my signature curved sharply and proudly to the left. When a pipeline leaks, you don't scream at it, you seal it. I wasn't going to confront Saskia with emotional arguments or empty shouting. I was going to use the law, the very weapon she trusted most, to crush her. The next 6 weeks were the greatest test of mental and emotional endurance Emmeline and I had ever faced in our 40 years of marriage. Following attorney Beatrix Montgomery's strict instructions, we had to act as if we knew absolutely nothing. We had to live under the same roof, share meals, and smile while a parasitic war was being waged against us from the inside. We had to watch them pretend to love us while they prepared our financial execution. I went to work every morning at the water treatment plant, my mind constantly calculating water pressures and legal timelines. Emmeline continued her routine of cleaning the house and preparing dinner. Saskia still stopped by 2 or 3 times a week, wearing the same sweet, thoughtful smile, bringing fresh pastries or baking a homemade cake. But now, every single time she walked through our front door, I saw the invisible stain of the dead notary's seal branded across her forehead. It was utterly revolting, a physical effort not to wipe that fake smile off her face. One evening, during the 3rd week of our silent war, Saskia sat at our mahogany dining table, chatting with Emmeline. With a casual, almost careless tone, she mentioned that she was reviewing some family paperwork to make tax management more convenient for us as we got older. She suggested that it might be wise to add her name as an administrator on a few of our personal investment accounts, claiming it would save us from having to deal with the complex paperwork in our retirement. Emmeline looked Saskia straight in the eyes. My wife was a gentle, soft-spoken woman, but she was no fool. When I had shown her the photographs of the forged signature, pointing out the D that curved the wrong way, and explained the truth about the dead notary's seal, she hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. She had simply stood in silence for a long, heavy moment before nodding her head slowly. She had processed the betrayal with the quiet, unbreakable steel of a mother who had realized her own child was helping an outsider rob her. Now, as Saskia sat at her table, offering her sweet, poisonous suggestions, Emmeline simply smiled gently, taking a slow, elegant sip of her chamomile tea. That night, after Saskia had left, Emmeline stood at the kitchen sink, washing the porcelain teacup her daughter-in-law had just used. She turned to me, her voice terrifyingly calm, her eyes reflecting the cold light of the kitchen. That girl remembered exactly how I like my coffee, Garrick, and forged my husband's signature with the very same hand. I almost have to admire the sheer chilling coldness of her heart. She didn't view us as family, she viewed us as assets to be liquidated. Emmeline's quiet composure gave me a renewed, unbreakable strength. We no longer saw Saskia as our daughter-in-law. She was an intruder, a toxic threat to our survival. Throughout those 6 agonizing weeks, Beatrix Montgomery worked tirelessly behind the scenes, building our legal armor piece by piece. The emergency court orders were granted. The bank accounts were quietly frozen under a sealed judicial directive, preventing any funds from being withdrawn or transferred. The prestigious law firm of Vance and Blackstone LLP was served with a confidential administrative subpoena. Shocked by the evidence of notary fraud originating from their own office, the firm's senior partners immediately launched a secret internal audit, discovering that Saskia had been using their corporate client databases and official legal stationery to facilitate her personal financial schemes. They began building their own file to terminate and prosecute her. But Saskia and Julian remained completely in the dark. They still believed their failing restaurant, the Gilded Hearth, was going to be rescued by the hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting in our family trust. They believed they were playing a high-stakes game of chess, completely unaware that I had already swept their king off the board. Every single afternoon, I reviewed the live footage from the hidden security camera in our living room. I watched Saskia quietly checking our physical mailbox before Emmeline and I returned from work, searching for any warning letters from the bank. I watched her make frantic, hushed phone calls from our sofa, her face growing increasingly pale and anxious as the days passed and the trust funds remained locked. The trap had been laid, every steel link of the chain secured in place. All it needed now was a single spark to trigger the collapse. The 6 weeks of silent, grueling endurance finally paid off on a cold Friday afternoon. Beatrix Montgomery called my private line, her voice filled with a calm, professional victory that made the weight on my shoulders feel slightly lighter. Every piece of forensic evidence had been certified. The bank had provided the surveillance footage of the forgery. Saskia's law firm had completed their audit, compiling a massive file of her corporate infractions. Court had approved our petition. Saskia, growing increasingly desperate as the restaurant's debt mounted and the bank funds remained frozen, took the initiative. She called Emmeline, her voice sounding high-pitched, strained, and filled with a false, manic excitement. She said she was bringing her parents over to our house for a special family breakfast on Saturday morning. She claimed she had a massive, wonderful surprise to announce, a project that would secure our family's wealth forever. She believed that Saturday was going to be the day she finally collected the reward for her 6 months of meticulous, silent planning. She believed she was going to walk out of our house with her hands on our life savings. But she had absolutely no idea that I had prepared a very different surprise for her, waiting right at the front door. Saturday morning arrived, the coastal sky over Portland as dark and cold as a sheet of lead. A freezing heavy rain began to fall, pattering against the windows of our dining room, matching the grim, unyielding determination in my heart. I stood in the center of the living room, wearing my best flannel shirt, holding the heavy blue case file Beatrix Montgomery had delivered to my office the night before. At exactly 9 a.m., Saskia's parents' luxury sedan pulled into our driveway, its tires crunching against the wet gravel. Their loud, wealthy laughter drifted through the door as they walked onto the front porch, just as it had 6 weeks earlier. They shook off the rain, adjusting their expensive coats, preparing to celebrate their stolen victory. Julian walked in first, followed by Saskia and her parents, Alistair and Vivienne Thorne. They carried themselves with the effortless, arrogant confidence of people who believed they had already won. But the triumphant, practiced smile on Saskia's face froze. The moment she saw Emmeline and me already seated at the dining table, there was no breakfast, there was no fresh coffee. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence that made the room feel like the moments before a violent storm. Julian frowned, stepping forward with the false confidence of a son who believed he was the master of the household. He looked at me, his voice sharp, condescending, and impatient. "Dad, what is this? I already told you. Saskia's family is here to discuss an extremely important corporate matter today. You and Mom should go out for a walk. We need the space. Why haven't you set the table?" I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed the thick blue file flat on the mahogany table. The soft, heavy click of the cardboard echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. I looked my son straight in his eyes, my gaze cold and unyielding. "Julian, this is my house, and the only person who needs to leave this room is your wife." Saskia stepped forward quickly, her face pale but her professional composure as a senior legal assistant immediately kicking in. She forced a sweet, innocent laugh that sounded entirely hollow. Dad, I really don't understand what you're talking about. I've done nothing but try to take the best possible care of this family. If we're discussing the trust modifications, it was all done to protect your interests. You're getting older, and mistakes happen. There's no need to make a scene in front of our guests. I opened the blue file slowly, the paper rustling in the tense, silent room. I slid the copy of the forged power of attorney across the mahogany table, letting it land directly in front of her. Beside it, I placed the certified death record of Notary Public Cassian Sinclair, and the account freeze order issued by the state court. So this is how you take care of this family, Saskia? I asked, my voice a freezing, quiet whisper that dropped the temperature of the room by 20 degrees. By forging my signature on a power of attorney. By using the official seal of a man who died 6 months ago to quietly drain our family trust. Saskia's face drained of every single drop of color, turning a stark, ghostly white before flushing a bright, burning red. Her eyes darted back and forth across the documents, desperately searching for a legal escape, a loophole, a defense. She looked like a trapped animal in a cage she had built with her own hands. But there was nothing. Beatrix Montgomery had sealed every single door, leaving her absolutely no room to maneuver. Her parents, Alistair and Vivian Thorne, picked up the paperwork, their hands beginning to tremble violently as they read the charges of notary fraud, identity theft, and corporate misconduct. They looked at their daughter, their proud high society expressions shattering into a mask of pure horror. Julian stared at the incorrectly curved D on the forged signature, his face turning completely pale as panic flashed in his eyes. He turned toward his wife, his voice shaking with a cowardly, desperate performance as he tried to play the victim. "Saskia, what is this?" Julian barked, his voice cracking, his fingers clutching his hair. "You told me this was completely legal. You told me it was just a standard family trust update. Why would you forge my dad's signature? Why would you do this to us?" I watched my son's pathetic performance. He wasn't shocked by the forgery itself. He was absolutely terrified because the crime had been exposed, and he was trying to throw his accomplice overboard to save his own skin. He wanted to preserve his inheritance and his freedom, even if it meant destroying the woman he had partnered with. But Saskia wasn't the kind of woman who would quietly take all the blame alone. When she realized she had been cornered, the polished, elegant facade of the professional legal assistant vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, vicious malice. She whipped around to face Julian, her eyes wide with fury, letting out a wild, high-pitched laugh that sounded like metal tearing apart on an assembly line. "Are you honestly going to pretend you're innocent, Julian?" Saskia screamed, her voice raw, hoarse, and dripping with hatred. "You're the one who handed me the original family trust documents from your father's private desk. You're the one who gave me the mailbox key so I could intercept every single warning letter from Casco Bay Trust. How dare you try to play the victim now? You signed the restaurant's financial reports every single month. You knew exactly where the money was coming from. You were begging me to find a way to get the funds." The living room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a sledgehammer striking a steel pipe. I turned slowly to look at my only son. Julian stood frozen, his face completely drained of color. His hands hung limply at his sides, sweat beading across his forehead. He couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. He lowered his head toward the floor, and that silence was the only answer I needed. My own flesh and blood had helped an outsider destroy our home. He had chosen to betray the father who had raised him, worked himself to the bone for 31 years to give him a future, and trample on the retirement savings of the mother who had loved him unconditionally. A crushing, physical pain tightened across my chest, hurting far more than any blow an enemy could have ever delivered. I felt as though the very foundation of my life had collapsed into a dark, bottomless abyss. I looked at the senior police officer standing just outside the front door, who had been waiting for my signal. "Take her away," I said, my voice dry, hollow, but completely unwavering. "And if my son bears any legal responsibility as an accomplice, follow the law to the absolute letter. Do not show him any special treatment because of his name." The front door burst open with a cold blast of wind. 3 uniformed police officers entered the living room, carrying an official arrest warrant. The cold, metallic handcuffs clicked shut around Saskia's wrists as her parents watched in stunned, silent humiliation. As she was escorted out into the freezing rain, her screams of rage and curses faded into the howling wind. Julian collapsed to his knees on the hardwood floor, weeping bitter tears of regret that had come far too late. He begged Emmeline for forgiveness, reaching out to touch the hem of her skirt, claiming that the restaurant's debt had clouded his judgment, that Saskia had convinced him it was only a temporary loan from the trust. Emmeline didn't say a single word. She didn't cry. She simply pulled her skirt away from his fingers and turned her back on her only son, walking slowly into the kitchen and closing the door behind her. Her silent, absolute withdrawal was the harshest sentence he could have ever received. It was the sound of a mother's love dying. The legal battle that followed was swift, precise, and devastating. Backed by the mountain of forensic evidence compiled by Beatrix Montgomery, Saskia was charged with first-degree document forgery, identity theft, and grand larceny. She was immediately terminated from Vance and Blackstone LLP, her legal assistant certification permanently revoked, and she was sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation, with her career, her license, and her high society reputation completely destroyed. The gilded hearth was seized by the bank to satisfy its debts, declaring complete bankruptcy and leaving them with nothing. As for Julian, because he had not personally signed the forged documents and had no direct knowledge of the counterfeit notary seal, he avoided prison. But he lost everything: his wife, his career, his restaurant, his social standing, and the trust of his parents. A few days later, my best friend Gideon arrived at the house, carrying a brand new set of heavy brass locks in his hands. I stood on the porch, unscrewing the old lock set from the solid oak door. The screws had gathered dust over the years, once symbolizing the security of our home, but the past 6 weeks had proven otherwise. I installed the new lock, tightening every single screw with a slow, deliberate motion. I pushed the door shut, inserted the new key, and turned it. The lock clicked crisply into place. The security system had been reset. Julian stood on the edge of the lawn, watching me work. He didn't dare step onto the porch. He remained standing in the shadow of the old maple tree, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind, staring at the new key in my hand. He knew that the old key in his pocket was now nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap metal. He no longer had the freedom to walk into this house. I stepped down from the porch, standing in front of my son. I didn't look at him with anger. I looked at him with the cold calmness of a systems guardian, who had just repaired a burst pipeline and sealed the main valve. I handed him a small duffel bag containing his clothes and personal belongings. "You are my son, Julian," I said, my voice slow and unwavering. "As a father, I can forgive you. But as the owner of this home, I can never trust you again. Trust is not a gift that is simply given. It is a structure that must be built block by block from the very foundation. Now you need to leave and take responsibility for your own life. Do not come back here until you can stand on your own 2 feet honestly." Julian took the bag, tears streaming down his face. He nodded slowly, turned around, and walked away down the street, disappearing into the cold coastal fog. I returned to the porch, sitting down in my rocking chair. The evening breeze blew off the bay, carrying fresh, clean, and peaceful air. Feeling safe inside your own home is priceless, and sometimes protecting that safety requires making the most painful decisions of all. Looking back on this journey, there are 3 profound life lessons I want to share with you today. Lesson 1. Never confuse compliance with affection. Saskia's meticulous politeness, her perfect coffee, her warm towels, and her sweet smiles were never driven by respect or love. They were a cold, calculated strategy to study our habits, find our vulnerabilities, and bypass our defenses. She was studying the blueprint of our house to find the weakest point in the foundation. True love is honest, unpolished, and sometimes messy. Clinical perfection is often just a mask for greed. Lesson 2. When a system is compromised, you must shut off the main valve immediately. You cannot negotiate with a leak. You cannot make a deal with a parasite. You must cut off the flow completely, even if it means severing your own flesh and blood to protect the foundation of your life. If you allow the leak to continue out of pity, it will eventually wash away the entire structure. Lesson 3. Trust is an expensive structure. It takes 30 years to build, but it can be destroyed in less than 10 seconds by a single cowardly choice. Once that structure collapses, do not try to rebuild it with the same broken pieces. Move forward, establish your boundaries, and never apologize for protecting your peace. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of the importance of protecting your assets and your boundaries, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to support this channel where the truth always wins, hit the like button and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you watched this far, along with the city you love. Thank you for joining Whispered Truths. Protect your family, protect your assets, and always stay alert. Until next time, peace.